This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I'd greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders. Today, I'm honored to have Douglas Squirrel on the show. And what's interesting about him is he goes by Squirrel. I was pretty cool about that. We're going to talk a little bit about agile conversations. We're talking about how leaders can learn more about communicating and just becoming better at building great teams. Anyway, with all that being said, Douglas, welcome to the show.
Oh, glad to be here.
So, Squirrel, if you don't mind, just give us a little bit about your background, how you got to where you are, and what is it exactly that you're doing?
Exactly. Well, I got here by getting fired. So what happened to me is that, I was CTO, VP engineering, one of those types of roles for a whole series of different businesses. And from every one, I got fired. It was in a really nice way, though. So the CEO or somebody like that would come to me and say, Squirrel, you built this great team, and they have fantastic processes, and they have a super leader, and they're really doing a world of good. And there's not much for you to do anymore, Squirrel. And you know what? You're kind of expensive. So why don't you go be wonderful somewhere else?
Ouch.
And, that was okay the first and the second time, but the third or fourth, I started to say I should probably plan for this. What I seem to do, because I also got faster and faster each time, what I seem to do is come in, help a team to function better, and then get the heck out of the way so they can continue to do great things. And so I became a consultant. And that lasted a couple of years of interim roles. So I would be the CTO for a couple of different companies at a time, but I kept getting faster. So that's when I switched to consulting, advising, evaluating, and that's what I do these days. And I've done it about 300 times for all different organizations, every size, every industry, every continent except Antarctica. And it's been a blast all the way through.
Awesome. So, there's a tech conference. I don't know if they're still doing it. Maybe they paused after COVID, where they take a cruise ship to Antarctica.
Okay.
The conference is on the cruise ship, and they do speaking engagements from Antarctica. And the reason why that was set up, the person that set that up did it so that they could be a speaker on every continent.
Excellent. Well, then I need to sign up for that for sure.
So maybe Google that. So, when you talk about getting fired, and I'm curious about, you said that felt good, or didn't feel so bad the first time. Do you think that that's a common thing that happens to leaders, that they grow good teams, they build processes? Because that's what we try to do as leaders. We want to build good leaders underneath us to kind of take our role. And if we're not doing that along the way, we're probably not doing our job.
Well, and I don't think it happens often enough. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right to ask the question. That's exactly what people claim they're aiming for. But there's often a big difference between what people espouse and what they actually do. And far too many organizations encourage that. They coddle people into behaving in a negative way, i.e., this is my role, this is my fiefdom, this is what I run, and I'm in charge of it, and I don't want anyone else to touch it. And I've had some really toxic examples of that. I had one person tell me point blank once that he wouldn't explain to me how his job worked, what he used on the computer that my software team was providing, because he had his job and I had mine, and I should butt out. And guess what? We didn't keep him around for very long because we were trying to create a model that's like the one you and I, John, would like to have. But far too many organizations encourage that behavior and even reward it, right? If you expand your fiefdom, you get more budget, more people, more bonuses. And that's horrifically negative and very unproductive. So I think more folks should be encouraging their team members to move on, to try new things, even to leave the company, provided that provides a better outcome for the organization, which it typically does.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And, I've been in organizations where a lot of executives set up silos and, try to grow. I call it kingdom build. They're trying to build their kingdom of advancing and, having more people under their privy versus looking at what's actually needed, sharing information, being more transparent, and sharing services and resources and working as a single unit instead of individual units to achieve the goal. How is it that, a leader, if they're in that situation where they see other executives kingdom building and they want to help that, how do you go about starting that conversation and maybe breaking down those walls?
Well, and what you don't do is grab a sledgehammer and start knocking down the walls, because I've tried that and it doesn't work. The kind of coercive, destructive approach doesn't help. And that's what's counterintuitive, because a lot of folks look at that and they say, oh, there goes John again. He's building his walls, he's building his fiefdom, and we just can't do anything about that. Or we have to fire John and his entire team and start all over again. These two radical extremes, they may appeal to us engineers who like zeros and ones, but that's not the best approach. What I find is that counterintuitively, it helps you most to really listen to the other person. This is a particularly challenging thing. I deal with it in chapter 2 of the book. And most people are not very good at really listening unless they practice it. And I'll go into that more if you want to talk more about it, John. But the whole point is that when you understand the reason that the person is building a kingdom, it can often be very different from the one you thought. And the approach you take to deal with it may be really, really radically altered. For example, if a squirrel has told John, don't let anybody else into your kingdom, then dealing with John is not going to help. John's just going to look over his shoulder and say, oh my God, I'm going to get fired unless I do what I'm told. So once you find out genuinely what the concerns and issues are, you often wind up with very radically different solutions that are much more effective. And that's where I'd start.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the listening part. And because I've seen and I struggle myself sometimes with being a leader and wanting to talk. And I know that, and one thing I always tell myself is, God gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you talk. But it's a tough thing to do. It's an easy thing to say, but it's a tough thing to do.
Yep. So let me give you a couple of tools for that. The first one is a tool called a genuine question. And John, let me illustrate by asking you a question that is anything but genuine, 180 degrees from what we want. And so, John, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're in a court of law, and I'm a lawyer on the other side, and I'm trying to convict you. Now, imagine the sorts of questions. First of all, how do you feel? You feel very defensive, your heart's racing, you're very nervous being there on the stand. That we haven't created a good environment for collaboration or finding a solution or building a kingdom together or something. But even more than that, I'm trying to box you in. I don't want to hear anything surprising. I wouldn't want you to start telling me about your childhood and your difficulties with learning new things or anything else that might, your difficulties in getting into university or something like that. Mm-hmm. I don't want to hear a sob story from you. I want to hear about very specific things. So I'll ask you a question like this. John, you were outside the building revving the engine in your car, weren't you? And inside the building was your friends, and they were all robbing the bank, weren't they? And you were ready to help your friends because you care about your friends, don't you? So those kind of leading questions, of course, I'm building a narrative here that's very negative for you, but they're hard to escape. And very often our tendency as leaders, when we are convinced of the right answer, John is guilty, we will come with those leading questions that don't admit any other surprising answers. And we're trying to make sure that we only hear what we want. And that's the most damaging. That's the way to shut down listening as fast as you possibly can. The opposite is a thing called a genuine question. And I'll try one of those on you, John, because I was beating you up before and giving you this giving you a heart attack over there. Let me suggest how I might ask a genuine question. John, can you tell me more about why my team hasn't been able to work with yours as effectively as we'd like? I'm seeing that we aren't collaborating, that our teams don't meet together, and I'm wondering what are your thoughts on why that happens?
Yes, so it sounds like that question's more of a why, more of a let me explain things versus a yes.
And I want you to explain, because I want you to say something like, well, the real reason is that squirrel guy, he keeps coming over and, telling us to get back to our desks. Mm-hmm. And then I know, wait a minute, it's not John, it's that squirrel guy. I got to go deal with him. Or John says, yeah, the last 5 times we've come over, your team has been dismissive and insulting, and, frankly, we just don't want to talk to you anymore. Hey, then I got a team problem. But both of those would be very surprising if I think that you're empire building and that's your motivation. And if I shut myself down and if I limit myself only to that explanation, then I'm not going to have the opportunity to hear a surprise. And if I carefully plan my interaction with you so I ask a genuine question that might give me a surprising answer, I'm ready for that surprising answer. And 9 times out of 10, I don't hear what I expect, and I'm really glad that I did.
No, yeah, I like that. I like the fact that you're anticipating not getting a surprise and actually getting that. And the fact that you're welcoming for that. Because I know when you go back to the other situation of the non-genuine question, attorneys don't want a surprise. And you want you don't want to ask a question unless you know the answer that you're going to get. But asking a question where you don't have a clue what the answer is going to be and expecting that is nice.
It certainly has helped me throughout my career. After I discovered this idea of genuine questions, it wasn't my idea. It came from a very clever sociologist in the 1970s who wrote a bunch of very academic papers. His name is Chris Argyris. And he came up with this original idea of genuine questions, which then I've developed extensively, worked with my co-author, Jeffrey, and we wrote a whole book about all these types of techniques for getting better, often very surprising options and information that you wouldn't otherwise hear.
So when it comes to, what you share, one of the things that I've discovered in trying to, tear down these walls is sometimes people don't want to genuinely answer those questions. So when you ask them, they're kind of hesitant. Do you have to take the first step in being transparent and open first and sharing information to kind of like knock those walls down a little bit? Or how does that, how have you seen those interactions happen in the past?
Well, it definitely helps if you can be open and transparent. You may not feel comfortable doing so. You might be very mistrustful of the other person. You've been screwed before and you don't want to, and that's a valid thing. So I wouldn't suggest necessarily that your only option is to say, hey, let me put all my cards on the table, tell you everything that's troubling me, and here you go. That would work if you feel okay about it, but in this situation that you're describing, you may not.
Right.
But what I do recommend in that case is something called say what you see. And I did a tiny bit of it in the previous example, but let me expand on that. So what you might say is, John, the last 3 times we've met together, you've been red in the face, your hands have been shaking, and you've given me very, very short answers. Have you observed those things as well, or am I missing something? Now, you notice I'm saying something that I observed. I haven't given any explanation for it. And then I've asked you a genuine question about it because I've just asked whether you observe the same thing. You might say, no, I'm not doing that. I don't notice that. And that would be very interesting. Or you might say, yes, and that's because I have the Martian flu and, I really feel ill. I think I'm going home after this. Both of those would be surprising, interesting answers that would tell you a lot about your situation. So if you are feeling mistrustful of the other person, it's very helpful to say that. And you will definitely have a very interesting trust-building conversation after you say something like, John, the last 3 times I brought you an issue, I never heard anything more about it. Is that something that you noticed? And could you tell me more about how that came to be? And then after you hear more, you might say something like, and I hope you might understand that makes it more difficult for me to share information with you. Does that make sense, or do you see it differently? Again, a genuine question about the observation, which doesn't obligate you then to share more information, which you may feel very uncomfortable about. But then you're having a conversation about the interaction, about the conclusions that you're drawing, and that's very often really informative. It often builds trust. Sometimes it just tells you this person isn't to be trusted or isn't somebody who's interested in building a relationship with you. All of those are interesting. And I'd recommend that your listeners try those kinds of techniques, which I'm happy to say more about.
Yeah, so I think that's very fascinating, and I do love to hear about those techniques. I was wondering, I know you wrote a book that really caught my attention. The title of it did anyway, Agile Conversations, Transform Your Conversations and Your Culture, a few years ago. Do you talk more about those techniques in there?
I certainly do. I'm not trying to sell the book. If anybody really wants a copy, you just get in touch. I'll get you one. But I didn't come on here to sell. But
Right.
certainly the book has multiple chapters, each of which is about different types of challenges you might have and specific techniques for them. I think the most challenging thing about, say, a book like The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which describe really well what might not be working,
Right.
is that those books then don't tell you what to do. Whereas the book I wrote with Jeffrey Frederick, Agile Conversations, gives you specific steps. For example, ask a genuine question when you're uncertain. Say what you see. And another technique we haven't talked about yet is called the ladder of inference, or sometimes called, we call it the test-driven development for people. And that's a process with specific steps, specific next things to do at each stage of building trust with someone. And I've had loads of my coaching clients and people who read the book try this and build significant amounts of trust. And that what's most helpful is having that step-by-step guide instead of just, as Lencioni in 5 Dysfunctions of a Team would say, go on a ropes course with the other person and then you'll trust them. That doesn't actually work. And it's much more helpful to say, I'm going to say this and then that, and I'm going to adjust my conversations in that way, and I'm going to train myself to use these methods. And when you have them on hand, you have the techniques in your quiver, as it were, you'll be much better able to hit the target.
No, yeah, I like that. I like that idea too, because one of the things that I found when I took a new leadership role, where the predecessor did not have good trust with his peers, I set up these, reoccurring meetings, just one-on-ones, and I tried to do it in their offices to try to make them more comfortable, or on a walk, which I prefer outdoor walks. I think that's a great way to have a level playing field and open up your, mind to what's going around you, and just have a better conversation. But just having those basic conversations, and letting people share, being curious, has helped me when it comes to building relationships to allow people to open up. And usually, like the first couple of meetings, they don't open up. But if you continue at it and you share things and you ask questions, like you said, genuine questions where you're really curious and, flex that curiosity muscle that you have, it really helps people to come around and then start sharing things that they might not have shared with your predecessor.
And let me be even a bit more challenging, John. So I'll just, I think what you're describing is fantastic. And if your listeners just applied that, they'd be doing wonderfully. I'll just illustrate that you can go farther if you want to. Namely, I typically build trust with people in the first 5 or 10 minutes of interacting with them. Now, I've been doing this for a decade, and I'm not always successful. Sometimes I do have folks who are quite reserved, and they aren't able to open up for a while. But I'm just illustrating that if you diligently apply techniques like this, if you continue to practice and improve over time, just like somebody who can, kick their, do a karate kick and break 7 concrete blocks at once. You don't do that on day one, but after you practice, you can get further. And so, for example, I was just with some clients in the continent of Europe, and they had just fired half their team. And I was coming in the day after to meet with the remnants. Now, that's a very defensive situation, right? People are not ready to open up. But using techniques like this, I was able to learn a lot about what the team needed and chart a course forward that they're now, at least the ones who are interested, are energetically taking up. So it is eminently possible to create that kind of trust very, very quickly, but it's not easy. The steps, though, are pretty easy to start with, and if you start on them, you get better and better. So that's what I suggest your listeners do.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Everything takes practice, and a lot of people don't realize that. They think that some people are just born with that ability, and maybe they have a different starting line. Maybe they're closer to that. But everything you do really takes effort and practice. And
John, one of the worst things about conversations is people do it all the time. We're having one right now, and we didn't necessarily spend a lot of time practicing and getting better at this conversation. And so I like to relate it to something that we're all watching on telly, just as you and I are having this conversation, namely the Olympics and the race walkers. So you've got those folks who walk really fast. They don't run, but they walk. And they are doing something all of us started doing at the age of about 2, but they do it in a very disciplined, very careful, very thoughtful way. And they're a heck of a lot better at it than you and me. They can walk faster than you and I can run. And in a similar way, it's really valuable to look at conversations as something we all do all the time, but not as well as we could. and to become a race walker for conversations. That's what I'd challenge your listeners to do.
I think that's a great thing to try to do. And we all need to practice it. And for me, the best way that I do it is one-on-ones. And I'm very introverted, believe it or not. And I don't like to have one-on-one conversations. Put me on a stage giving a speech. I am good at that because I don't feel like I don't have that fear of that one-on-one rejection, I guess, that I used to have. And maybe it's because I've given lots of talks. I've been a teacher, so I'm used to speaking in front of a classroom of people. So I'm good at that part of it. But when you put me one-on-one, I get very uncomfortable. And I'm probably more nervous giving a one-on-one with a person that reports to me than they are getting it from me. But the more I do it, the more comfortable I get doing it. You know what I mean? You kind of have to build those muscles.
Indeed. And just like those race walkers might walk around a track or on a treadmill or do leg exercises or something else that helps them get better and better in a controlled environment, not a race. One thing I'd encourage you to do, I do this with my coaching clients all the time, is have you practice in some controlled environment doing the thing that makes you nervous, in which you feel you don't perform as well as you could. And so that might look like having a practice conversation off a script. So you write down what you would like each person to say and what you're thinking and feeling during it, so you can practice bringing those in. There's a whole series of exercises in the book all about how to do that kind of deliberate practice. And my other suggestion for that might help you, John, is, John, do you have any 8-year-olds available to you or somebody around that age? Is there?
I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old.
Perfect. Well, you got it bracketed there. So pick either one, whoever likes to give you the hardest time. And so one thing that can really help you with your confidence there is to have them throw something at you from a list, the sorts of things that might come up in the one-on-one. They don't even have to understand it. They just enjoy throwing something at an adult and seeing how they do. And then you practice giving the response. And they grade you. That's the part that the kids love the most. You can do this with a sweetheart. You can do this with the mirror. You can do it with many folks. But 8-year-olds are the very best because they both understand what you're talking about, basically. And they love pointing out where you have not done it well. And they do that in a fun way.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I love to use my kids for things like that. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget what I was given a talk on leadership. So I went and asked my kid, it was my daughter, she's 13 now, but at the time I think she was 6 or 7. And I just said, so what is a leader? She's like, the person in the front of the line when you go to the bathroom. I was like, oh, okay. And I said, well, why is it
okay? Well, that's very specific.
To have a leader. And she's like, oh, well, because they show you where to go. I'm like, oh,
yeah, you might get off, not get to the bathroom.
Yep. I can use that. They show you where to go. Because that means they're leading by example, right? Just like, yeah, they're going there first and you just follow them. I'm like,
excellent.
So, you get those little nuggets from time to time. So I think using kids is fantastic. Another thing that, you could set up a Zoom meeting with yourself and just record it.
Yep.
Have the conversation and then go back and watch and see how you did. That's the way I practice a lot of my talks is I'll give it to a Zoom, recording a Zoom screen by myself and just see how I do. And that's where no one's a harder critic on me than me. And I think a lot of people are like that.
Indeed. I'll tell you one other, which you've made me remember, which is you can use ChatGPT for this or any other large language model, because the great thing about those things is, you ask them for some fact and they make it up, and that's a problem. But if you ask them to be your difficult boss that you need to ask for a pay rise, and you say no to me in an unfriendly way, they'll make up a new unfriendly way that you hadn't thought of. So you'll practice even more your conversational skills, your ability to kind of hit the ball back without dropping the racket during the conversation. And so the large language models actually are really good as an actor or a troupe of actors. You can ask them to be your board of directors or somebody, a group of people, and they'll do it really well and make stuff up, which is what you want. Yeah,
that's great. I've actually done that. I had to have a difficult conversation with an employee, and I just said, pretend like you're an employee, and I put that does this, and I put their kind of their, not their job title, but a similar job title, and I have to tell you X, Y, and Z. How would you respond? And they came back, as if it was that employee. Well, I would be upset because of this, this, and this, and I was like, oh, and I didn't know what to say. I said, so what would you want to hear back? And then it told me, and I was like, oh, well, that's good. I can use that.
Perfect. So you're using it really there like a mirror to reflect back to you what it is that might be helpful. But if you haven't got an 8-year-old easy to hand, then ChatGPT can fill in pretty well.
Yeah, and in reality, it wasn't at all what the employee was really thinking, but
No, of
it
course
made
not.
me,
But
it
you
made me a lot
practiced.
more confident, right? It gave me that confidence going into the conversation so that I could express it and, didn't feel as nervous handling the situation.
Absolutely.
Another thing that, when it comes to things that you've worked on in the past, what are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to improving a company's or a team's efficiencies, performance, and things like that?
Unfortunately, us engineers, most specifically, often don't know how to spell profit. And we don't understand what a balance sheet looks like. And we don't know the difference between capital expenditure and operational expenditure and stuff like that. And so the challenge is that that's the language that, say, the CFO will be speaking, that the finance people, that the board of directors, the CEO will be speaking. And we come along, I was just writing about this in my weekly newsletter today. We come along with a whole bunch of technobabble about Docker containers and improved hosting efficiency and serverless architectures. And none of that makes any sense to them, just as much as the language of finance doesn't make sense to us engineers. So bridging that gap is one of the biggest ways to unlock insane profitability for your technology team. It is challenging, but it's actually not as hard to learn. Say what goes into the stock price, or how a capitalization table works, or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's actually easier to learn than say Haskell or Python or something like that. So one thing I always counsel my the people I'm coaching and the people I'm talking to in my community and other folks like that is learn that language of business. And if you're on the other side of that, if you're trying to lead a bunch of geeks and they don't understand it, help them. Send them along to sit with the finance people for a while. Have a discussion about why it's so important that you reduce capital expenditure right now because of a financial event that's happening. A new investor coming on or something like that. Whatever the business initiative is, explain it in finance terms and help your engineers to speak that way. It really unlocks a lot.
I think that is great. And I have to say, I got lucky by getting my MBA early in my career and learning some of the skills as far as, the communication of how to present things as, with an ROI in there when you're presenting new projects instead of just what the benefits are. I think the ROI is really important when talking to finance. But you're absolutely right. Learning, you could, watch a few YouTube videos and learn the basics of a balance sheet and be able to at least speak the languages whenever you're meeting with other leaders about your projects and explain things in a business-like term. But also it works the other way around. I found that when I come back to my engineers and I explain why we can't do something from a business standpoint and where the business is at and what kind of opportunities that they have to be innovative and come up with other ideas that do meet these business requirements, it helps them as well. It's a lot better than just a hard, no, we don't have money for it. Yeah,
absolutely. So when you can get that dialogue going, using language that's meaningful to everybody in the room, you get a lot of new ideas. Just like asking genuine questions, you're going to get options and ideas that surprise you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to. Also, it builds teamwork. Before I started to do those kind of conversations and talk about projects with an ROI behind them all and making true business plans for them instead of just like, oh, this would be cool to move to the cloud or whatever we're going to do at the time.
Cool doesn't make any invoices come in. Cool doesn't reduce costs. It can, and that's the challenging thing, is that often those things are really valuable. But what I don't let my clients do is adopt a philosophy of what I call betterism, i.e., this is what Spotify is doing, this is what Facebook is doing, therefore it's better. This is the industry standard, this is the best practice. I will all those terms, because what you want to do is explain, why is that better for us? There's not some absolute notion of better. There's not a mathematical truth here that we're seeking. You can make statements about the prime numbers or about analytic functions or something like that, and they're true for all of those entities everywhere. Doesn't work in business. And so what you need to do is give the specifics for why in our situation with our current stock price, with our current investor landscape with the types of customers and the pressures we're under from our competitors, this type of switch to serverless or an improved architecture or something like that would help us to be more competitive. That's the kind of argument you need to make. And unfortunately, engineers aren't taught to do that at university. We should really change that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, one of the things that I found also, making those shifts about, instead of talking about, oh, so-and-so does this is really cool, going to the ROI conversation and explaining how things are better. It also built a relationship with, finance, so that I had that trust from them because I sort of saw it their way, instead of...
You spoke their language.
Exactly. Instead of that headbutting in between engineering and, finance, we're always going to butt heads because engineering costs so much money and they're just a call center. But if you explain things in a way that they understand and show an ROI that you're coming over to their side and helping them out, it totally changes the conversation.
Yep.
How can we do that with other departments? Because it's not just the financial piece of it, but sometimes we're having those conversations with sales or with HR or different groups that we also have to learn to speak those languages as well.
Well, I'll tell you two things. So the first is that leaders should spend time, and I always have to explain this to people who are new into this type of role or who just haven't been doing it, that when you become an executive, when you become any kind of manager, part of your job is actually to talk to people who don't report to you. They're often the most difficult to work with, and to build your relationship with them. So I'll tell somebody, so go to lunch with so-and-so down the pub and, make sure you really understand the issues that are happening over there in marketing. And the person will say, but what about my job? I'll say, that's your job. You need to do that, because then you'll be able to be much more effective at dealing with the new cookies that the marketing department want you to stick on the website, because you'll understand what they're trying to accomplish and you can explain to your team how to do that a better way that doesn't drive you bananas. I used to deal with that in an e-commerce company, and they wanted a new cookie every day. We had to get them on a new scheme, so they weren't demanding that, but they had a good reason for it. If I just said no, it wouldn't have worked as well.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is to understand their why behind that.
Understand the problem that they're trying to solve, and they often have trouble describing it to you because it's so obvious to them. Mm-hmm. And they use a language that's foreign to you. So building that relationship and that trust is the first step to understanding that language and understanding what other alternatives might be available. There often are much better ones. Mm-hmm. The other is spend some time in their shoes. Customer service is my favorite for this one. I had one very grumpy, very geeky and nerdy system administrator in a company whose customers were children. We had 8 and 10 and 12-year-olds who had debit cards. This was very new at that time, although you can get it from your bank pretty easily now. And so he didn't really understand what some of the challenges were. He'd insist on security protocols that made no sense for 7-year-olds to understand, and he really didn't get it. So I stuck him on the customer service phones, and I had him answer calls from 9-year-olds who were having trouble. He had one who was in McDonald's, I remember, and couldn't buy food and was crying on the phone. He became a completely different, non-grumpy person. He really understood, and he could go into the database and give this kid 10 pounds. And the kid was converted from a crying child into a happy child. And he converted from he was still grumpy. He still, would tell us about his latest exploits at the Star Trek conference. But what he was able to do was be much more empathetic with users. So getting your engineers talking to actual customers will give them a whole new insight, because typically they aren't your users.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a story similar to that. We were building, several companies ago, we were building a self-service portal for our customers to log in and use and solve basic problems. And I had my engineers my developers went and shadowed, so they would jump on with our internet support calls, and they would listen in on the calls and to get an understanding of how the customer was expressing themselves. Because we would say something like reboot, we had a link, this is for ISP, like reboot cable modem. You click the button, it would reboot your cable modem, which is, 9 times out of 10 would solve most of the internet service problems. But customers didn't even know what a cable modem was, back
of course
then.
Where it was,
so we had to listen to the
calls. The on and off switch was.
Exactly. We would listen to the calls to figure out what the customer's language was, so we could put the tools in there in those languages. So I call it taking a field trip. Go take a field trip, listen to your customers, listen to your team, listen to whoever your stakeholders are, and walk in their shoes.
salespeople call it a ride along. It's like what journalists do with police officers. They'll ride in the front seat of the police car. You should ride in the front seat of the sales car to learn what a sales conversation really sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic approach. Squirrel, this has been a great conversation, and I feel like I'm learning a lot of little techniques and tips that I can kind of use. How can people learn more about the things that you offer and connect with you online and, have a call with you?
Oh, there's all kinds of ways to do that. So the very best one is just to remember my name and go to douglassquirrel.com. And there you will find email and telephone number. I mean, you can come visit me in my 600-year-old house in England if you really want to. My home address is there. Just tell me before you come. But there's lots of ways to get in touch with me there and to get Agile conversations and lots of other things that I've written and done and so on. And then the other place to get these new ideas, because I'm churning them out all the time, I made reference to my community and my weekly emails and so on. That is at squirrelsquadron.com. That's my community of tech and non-tech people working together and learning together. It's the only community I know of like it, with thousands of people in it from around the world. We have people in Australia and Europe and US and Asia, and all of them are interested in making insane profits from their technology, but they're from all different disciplines. We have marketing and sales and customer service and engineers and product and everything else. So it's a great way to keep in touch with all of those folks and get loads of new ideas all the time, ask questions and get great answers. So either douglassquirrel.com or squirrelsquadron.com, or even better, both.
Awesome. And I think it's fascinating that you live in a house that's older than my country.
It is one of the wonderful things about being where I am. Sometimes I am unhappy about how hard it is to maintain, but most of the time I'm pleased to be preserving a little piece of English history.
I think that's awesome. And I'll link all that stuff out in the show notes too at getclearer.com so people can click through. And Squirrel, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate the conversation.
Lovely to be with you. Thanks so much, John.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.